You ever wonder how a small, isolated corner of the world could suddenly burst onto the global stage and terrorize an entire continent? Imagine this. For centuries, the people of Scandinavia were, by all accounts, a quiet, agrarian bunch. They farmed the unforgiving land, fished the icy seas, and generally kept to themselves. Their world was one of long, dark winters and brief, frantic summers. But then, something changes. Around the late 8th century, these same people, with their long ships and their inscrutable gods, suddenly appear on the coastlines of Europe, not as traders, but as something far more terrifying. They strike without warning, they plunder with brutal efficiency, and then they vanish back into the mists of the sea, leaving behind a trail of smoke and stories that will echo for 1,000 years. It's a bit like a gentle flock of sheep, suddenly deciding to become a pack of wolves overnight. The mystery isn't just about what they did, but why they did it, and how they did it with such speed and ferocity. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're tucked in somewhere cozy, maybe tell us where you are and what time it is for you. It's always nice to know who's out there listening. The most famous date in the history of the Viking Age is, of course, the year 793. That's the year that a group of Norsemen landed on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria in England, and sacked its wealthy monastery. It was a shocking event, a seismic shift in the European political and religious landscape. Monasteries, you see, were considered sacred ground. They were places of learning and sanctuary, filled with monks who were generally defenseless, and treasures that were often ornate and easily portable. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our best sources for the period, describes the event in suitably dramatic terms, noting dire portents came over the land of Northumbria and miserably afflicted the inhabitants. It speaks of whirlwinds and lightning and fiery dragons seen flying through the air, all signs of the coming disaster. And then the chronicle gets to the point, describing the pagan men who horribly destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. But here's a quiet little mystery for you. That raid might not have been the first one. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself records an earlier incident in 789, where 3 ships of Northmen landed in Dorset. The local reeve, or sheriff, rode out to greet them, thinking they were traders. He was promptly killed. Now, the Chronicle doesn't call these men Vikings, but it's widely accepted that they were. So, was Lindisfarne truly the beginning, or just the first one that really got everyone's attention? The historical record is a bit like a blurry photograph. You can see the main figures, but the details at the edges are often lost to time and circumstance. Perhaps the Lindisfarne raid was just the first one to hit a place with a good public relations department, a monastery full of literate monks who could actually write down what happened. So what turned these farmers into fearsome raiders? The traditional answer, the one you probably learned in school, is overpopulation. The idea is that Scandinavia's poor soil couldn't support its growing population, so the young men had to go abroad to seek their fortunes. It's a neat, simple theory, but modern historians are a bit more skeptical. They point out that there's not a lot of evidence for a massive population boom at the time, and besides, there were easier places to go than across the treacherous North Sea to raid a monastery. Another theory suggests that the Frankish expansion under Charlemagne might have been a factor. As Charlemagne's empire pushed north, it came into conflict with the Saxon and Frisian peoples, effectively blocking their traditional trading routes and creating a buffer zone. This, some scholars argue, may have pushed the Scandinavians to look for new opportunities elsewhere. Think of it like a crowded highway suddenly getting a detour. It forces everyone to find new routes, some of which might be less savory. But the most compelling theory, and perhaps the most complex, is that the raids were driven by a shift in social structures. The rise of powerful chieftains and kings in Scandinavia created a need for wealth and prestige. In a society where a man's status was often measured by his generosity and the size of his following, a good raid was a great way to get both. A chieftain could lead a successful expedition, come back with a hoard of treasure, and then distribute it among his warriors, solidifying their loyalty and attracting new followers. The treasure wasn't just gold and silver. It was also finely crafted goods, silks, and even slaves. The raids then were not just about survival. They were a form of political theater, a way for ambitious men to climb the social ladder. They were, in essence, the medieval equivalent of a CEO taking a company public and making all his early employees rich. Well, a much bloodier version, anyway. This shift in power and ambition, combined with some incredible advancements in shipbuilding, specifically the development of the longship, a vessel that was both fast and capable of navigating shallow rivers, created a perfect storm. The longship was a game changer, a technological marvel that gave the Vikings an unparalleled advantage. It could carry a large number of men, but its shallow draft meant it could also sail up rivers, allowing them to strike deep inland, far from the coast. A traditional warship of the time was a lumbering behemoth, good for naval battles, but useless for a hit-and-run raid up a river. The longship, on the other hand, was the ultimate surprise attack vehicle. It was a silent, deadly shark, and the unsuspecting coasts of Europe were its new hunting ground. The echoes of those first raids, particularly the one at Lindisfarne, sent shivers through the Christian kingdoms of Europe. But one powerful ruler was paying very close attention. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and soon to be Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne's empire, remember, was a massive, sprawling entity that stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe River, and his main goal was to unify this vast territory under the banner of Christianity. His expansionist policies, particularly his long and brutal war against the pagan Saxons, brought his borders right up against the Scandinavian world. You could say he was the big, muscular guy on the block who was actively pushing his weight around, and the folks just across the way were starting to notice. The Vikings, on their end, saw this great, rich, and well-organized empire as both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because Charlemagne was actively trying to Christianize their neighbors, and an opportunity because, well, the man had a lot of nice stuff. It's a strange kind of historical dance they performed, this Frankish emperor and the Norse chieftains. On the one hand, Charlemagne was building a series of fortifications along his northern coastlines, establishing a Frankish navy, and even trying to get a handle on the political landscape of Denmark. He was essentially trying to build a wall to keep the wolves out. But on the other hand, there's evidence of some surprisingly friendly contact. We have Frankish annals that speak of diplomatic exchanges, of a Danish king named Godfred, who, despite being a thorn in Charlemagne's side, also sent envoys to the Frankish court. It's a bit like a frenemy situation in high school. You're planning to fight each other after class, but you'll still trade snacks at lunch. This wasn't just a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. It was a complex geopolitical tango. Now, a significant moment in this relationship happened in 810. King Godfred of Denmark, a powerful and ambitious ruler, led a large fleet of 200 ships against the Frisians, a people who were under Charlemagne's protection. The Franks were terrified. They knew Godfred had a massive army and a reputation for being, shall we say, not so nice. Godfred's raid was so successful and so intimidating that he extracted a huge tribute from the Frisians before sailing back home. And here's a delicious little tidbit of historical drama. The Frankish annals claim that Godfred, in a moment of pure arrogance, even boasted that he would soon come to Aachen, Charlemagne's imperial capital, to make a name for himself. He never got the chance, though. The same annals report that he was assassinated shortly after returning home, supposedly by one of his own men. It's a mystery that has puzzled historians. Was it a political rival? Or perhaps even a Frankish-backed assassin? We'll likely never know for sure. But the timing is certainly convenient. The real shift in the relationship, however, came after Charlemagne's death in 814. His vast empire was soon plunged into civil war as his sons and grandsons squabbled over the inheritance. The Frankish state, once a cohesive and powerful bulwark, became a fractured mess. And what do wolves do when they see a pack of bickering dogs? They move in for the kill. The internal weakness of the Frankish Empire was a giant blinking neon sign for the Vikings that said, "Come and get it." The raids, which had been relatively sporadic before, now became more frequent, more organized, and more ambitious. Instead of just hitting coastal monasteries, they began sailing up the great rivers of Europe, the Seine, the Rhine, the Loire, and striking deep into the heart of the empire. They weren't just looking for quick plunder anymore. They were looking for tribute, for land, and for a place to settle down. This new phase of raiding led to the establishment of the Dangeld, a term that literally means Danish money. It was a protection racket, plain and simple. Local rulers, too weak to fight off the Viking raiders, would pay them massive sums of silver and gold to go away and leave them alone. It was a vicious cycle. The more they paid, the more the Vikings came back, knowing that the Franks were willing to fork over the cash rather than fight. The amount of wealth that was siphoned out of the Frankish Empire during this period is almost unimaginable. We're talking about tons of silver. And it wasn't all just a one-way street. Some Vikings, particularly those who converted to Christianity, were granted land in exchange for their loyalty and their promise to defend the coast against other Vikings. It was a classic set a thief to catch a thief strategy. And it worked, but only to a certain extent. A perfect example of this is the story of Rollo. Rollo was a Viking chieftain who was granted land by the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911. In exchange for his fealty and his conversion to Christianity, Rollo was given control of a territory in what is now northern France. This region would eventually become known as Normandy, from the Old French term for men of the north. Rollo's story is a beautiful illustration of how the relationship between the Franks and the Vikings evolved from one of pure conflict to one of begrudging coexistence. and eventually assimilation. His descendants, of course, would go on to be the Normans, who, as we all know, would conquer England a century and a half later. So, in a strange, roundabout way, the internal squabbles of the Frankish Empire and the cunning of a Viking chieftain would eventually lead to one of the most significant events in English history. A lot of dominoes had to fall just right for that to happen, didn't they? And it all started with Charlemagne and his big, beautiful, but ultimately fragile empire. While some Vikings were busy playing a complicated game of political chess with the Frankish Empire, others were finding a new and rather lucrative pastime, settling down. They looked west across the choppy grey waters of the North Sea and saw a land that was, for the most part, a lot like home, but with better weather and a lot more wealth. This land was the British Isles, a place where a fractured collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been fighting among themselves for generations. Imagine a neighborhood of squabbling siblings, each with a fancy toy, and then a well-armed, highly organized gang of outsiders shows up. It was a perfect opportunity for the Vikings, and they weren't about to miss it. The first major wave of settlement began in the mid-9th century. After years of hit-and-run raids, the Vikings changed tactics. They started to overwinter in England, building fortified camps and using them as bases for their campaigns. In 865, a massive army, which the Anglo-Saxons called the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This wasn't a raiding party. This was an invasion force. It was led by a few famous figures, including Ivar the Boneless, a man whose name is a great conversation starter at parties. The goal of this army wasn't just to steal stuff and leave. It was to conquer. They marched across the country, picking off the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia all fell to the Viking onslaught. Now, here's a little historical mystery that scholars still debate. What was the size of this great heathen army? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it as uncountable, a phrase that is, let's be honest, not very helpful for historians trying to get a head count. Modern estimates range wildly, from a few thousand to perhaps as many as 20,000. But even the lower estimates represent a massive, well-organized force for the time. This wasn't just a bunch of guys in longships. This was a professional army with a clear military objective. And they were successful, in no small part, because they were up against a bunch of disorganized kingdoms that couldn't seem to get their act together. It was a classic case of a smaller, more disciplined force defeating a larger but fractured enemy. The one kingdom that managed to hold out against this onslaught was Wessex, ruled by a man who would become one of the most famous figures in English history, Alfred the Great. Alfred, a thoughtful and pious man who was also a brilliant military strategist, was forced to fight a desperate guerrilla war against the Vikings. He suffered a major defeat and had to flee into the marshes of Somerset, where, according to a famous legend, he burned a peasant woman's cakes while sulking about his troubles. A nice story, but almost certainly not true, and it really distracts from the fact that he was, at that moment, a man who had lost his kingdom and was on the run. But Alfred, being Alfred, didn't give up. He rebuilt his forces, trained them properly, and in 878 he defeated the Viking army at the Battle of Edington. The victory was so decisive that the Viking leader, a man named Guthrum, was forced to accept a peace treaty, and more importantly, to be baptized as a Christian. This treaty, known as the Treaty of Wedmore, established a formal border between Alfred's Kingdom of Wessex and the Viking-controlled territory in the north and east. This territory would become known as the Danelaw, a term that refers to the region where Danish law, rather than Anglo-Saxon law, held sway. The Danelaw was a huge part of England, including major cities like York, which the Vikings called Jorvik, and the 5 boroughs of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford. The Vikings who settled here weren't just a bunch of marauders. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. They brought their own culture, their own language, and their own legal systems. The long-term impact on England was immense, with many place names and words in the English language today having Scandinavian roots. Ever been to a town that ends in by, like Derby or Grimsby? That's a Viking word for farm or settlement. The presence of the Danelaw fundamentally reshaped the political and cultural map of England. It created a situation where 2 distinct cultures and legal systems coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not so much. While Alfred the Great and his descendants worked tirelessly to reclaim the Danelaw, the Viking influence was permanent. The blood of the Northmen was mixed with that of the Anglo-Saxons, creating a new hybrid identity. The legacy of this period can be seen in everything from the legal system to the very language spoken. The Vikings who came to England, initially as invaders, ended up becoming an integral part of its history. They didn't just take a piece of land. They left an indelible mark on the country's very soul. While the Vikings were busy making a name for themselves in England, a different group of Norsemen was turning their attention to another nearby island, Ireland. Ireland at the time was a patchwork of small, warring Gaelic kingdoms, a bit like a medieval version of a messy apartment building with a dozen feuding tenants. This political fragmentation, combined with the island's rich monasteries and fertile land, made it an irresistible target. The first recorded raids in Ireland were around the same time as Lindisfarne, in the late 8th century, but they really ramped up in the 9th century. The Irish annals, our main source for this period, speak of these Norsemen, whom they called Gaul, or foreigners, arriving in waves, sailing up the rivers, and plundering everything in sight. The Viking strategy in Ireland was similar to their early raids in England. They would hit coastal monasteries, like the famous one on the island of Iona, steal the treasure, and then sail away. But as their presence grew, their tactics evolved. They started to build fortified coastal settlements, which the Irish called long forts. These long forts were essentially sea forts, a place where they could dock their ships, repair them, and use as a base for inland raids. These weren't just temporary camps. They were the beginnings of some of Ireland's most famous cities. Dublin, Cork, Waterford, and Limerick all started their lives as Viking long forts. It's a bit of an ironic historical twist, isn't it? The very places that were built to terrorize the local populace eventually became the vibrant, cosmopolitan centers of the country. The story of Dublin is a particularly good one. The Vikings established a long fort there in 841, right where the River Liffey meets the sea. It was a perfect strategic location. The settlement, which they called Dyflin, became a major center for the slave trade, something that was, unfortunately, a very big part of the Viking economy. The Vikings would raid inland, capture people, and then sell them off to markets all across Europe, and even as far as the Middle East. It's a grim aspect of their history, but an important one to remember. The wealth generated from this trade made Dublin one of the most important Viking settlements outside of Scandinavia itself. And here's an interesting little mystery. Historians still debate the exact location of the original Long Fort. Archaeological digs have unearthed a lot of evidence of the Viking presence, but the precise location of that first fortified camp remains a bit of a puzzle. The Vikings' relationship with the Gaelic Irish was incredibly complex. It wasn't just a simple matter of invaders versus the invaded. They traded with each other, they intermarried, and they even fought alongside each other. Irish kings would sometimes hire Viking mercenaries to help them in their endless wars against rival kingdoms. The Vikings, for their part, learned a lot from the Irish, including the intricacies of their legal system and the nuances of their political landscape. This intermingling of cultures created a new group of people, the so-called Norse Gaels, who had a unique blend of Viking and Gaelic traditions. They spoke a mix of Old Norse and Gaelic. They adopted some Irish names, and they wore a fascinating mix of both Viking and Celtic clothing. The high water mark of Viking power in Ireland came at the end of the 10th century. A powerful Viking king of Dublin, named Sigtrygg Silkbeard, was a major force to be reckoned with. But he was up against an equally powerful and ambitious Irish king, a man named Brian Boru, who was determined to unite all of Ireland under his rule. The conflict between these two men culminated in one of the most famous battles in Irish history, the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. It was a massive, bloody affair, with armies of Vikings and their Irish allies fighting against Brian Boru's forces. The battle itself is a fascinating mix of historical fact and legendary embellishment. The Irish annals describe it in epic, almost mythological terms, with heroes performing incredible feats of strength. What we do know is that Brian Boru's forces won a decisive victory. The Viking power in Ireland was broken, and while a Norse presence remained in the coastal cities, they were no longer the dominant political force. Brian Boru, however, was also killed in the battle, a tragic end for the man who had brought so much of Ireland under his control. The Battle of Clontarf didn't end the Viking presence in Ireland overnight, but it did mark the beginning of the end of their political and military dominance. The Vikings would eventually assimilate completely into Irish society, their long forts becoming a permanent part of the Irish landscape, and their descendants playing a quiet but important role in the country's history. While some Vikings were conquering kingdoms and building cities in the British Isles, another group was setting sail for a much more isolated and arguably more dramatic destination, Iceland. This wasn't an invasion or a raid. It was a mass migration, a deliberate move to a new land. The story of Iceland's settlement is unique in Viking history, a beautiful saga of escape and exploration. The traditional date for the beginning of the settlement, according to the Icelandic sagas, is 874, a year after a man named Ingolfur Arnason is said to have thrown his high seat pillars, the wooden posts from his chieftain's chair, overboard, vowing to settle wherever they washed ashore. It's a great story, but the truth is a bit more complex, with archaeological evidence suggesting a slightly earlier, more gradual process. So why Iceland? The sagas, our main historical source for this period, give us a clear answer. a desire to escape the growing power of centralized kingship in Norway. Remember how we talked about ambitious chieftains consolidating power? In Norway, a king named Harald Fairhair was doing just that. He was bringing all the small, independent chieftains under his heel, which meant they had to pay taxes and swear fealty to him. For a proud, independent-minded chieftain who was used to doing what he pleased, this was an unacceptable state of affairs. So they did what any self-respecting Viking would do. They packed up their families, their livestock, and their slaves, and they sailed west to a land they knew was uninhabited and, most importantly, free from the reach of kings. This migration was a deliberate, large-scale operation. People weren't just showing up randomly. They were bringing everything they needed to start a new life. They brought cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, as well as tools and seeds. The journey was long and perilous, but a steady stream of settlers made the trip over a period of about 60 years, from roughly 870 to 930. The settlers, for the most part, came from Western Norway, but also from the Viking colonies in Ireland and Scotland, bringing with them a mix of Norse and Celtic blood and culture. The archaeological evidence for this is fascinating, with some early burials in Iceland showing a definite mix of Scandinavian and Celtic grave goods. It's a wonderful example of a multicultural melting pot happening centuries before anyone started talking about such things. Once in Iceland, the settlers faced a harsh but spectacular landscape. It was a land of fire and ice, with active volcanoes, boiling hot springs, and massive glaciers. But it also had good pasture land in the coastal areas and plenty of fish in the surrounding seas. The settlers quickly established farms, and because there was no centralized king to tell them what to do, they had to figure out a new way to govern themselves. What they created was one of the most remarkable political systems of the medieval world, the Icelandic Commonwealth. The Commonwealth was not a kingdom, and it had no king. Instead, it was a parliamentary republic, and its main institution was the Althing. The Althing was an assembly, a kind of national parliament that met every summer for 2 weeks at a place called Thingvellir, which is a truly beautiful and geologically dramatic spot. At the Althing, chieftains and their followers would gather to settle legal disputes, pass laws, and discuss matters of national importance. The laws were not written down at first. They were recited from memory by a man called the Lögsögumadur, or law speaker. This position was elected for a 3-year term, and the law speaker was responsible for memorizing and reciting the entire legal code. It's a great job for a guy with a good memory and a lot of free time. This system, though it was unique, was far from perfect. Without a central executive power, there was no way to enforce the laws. If someone was found guilty of a crime, it was up to the victim and their family to carry out the sentence. This often led to blood feuds, a central theme in many of the famous Icelandic sagas. These sagas, written down much later, are our main source of information about this period. They're a mix of historical fact and fictional embellishment, but they paint a vivid picture of a society that was both fiercely independent and prone to violent internal disputes. It's a land of larger-than-life figures, of poets and warriors, of cunning lawyers and ruthless outlaws. The most famous of these outlaws, a man named Eric the Red, is a good example of how the Icelandic system worked, or sometimes didn't work. Eric was a hot-headed individual who was banished from Norway, and then, after settling in Iceland, was banished from there as well for killing someone. His banishment from Iceland led to one of the most famous stories of Viking exploration. But that's a tale for our next section. For now, just remember that the settlement of Iceland was a deliberate act of political rebellion, a search for a new land where a man could be his own master. And in creating the Althing, they created one of the world's oldest democratic assemblies, a lasting legacy of their desire for a life without kings. As we left off, a certain hot-headed individual named Eric the Red had just been banished from Iceland for a series of killings. Now, for most people, being banished from a remote volcanic island in the North Atlantic would be a bit of a problem. But for Eric, it was an opportunity. According to the sagas, he spent 3 years exploring a large mysterious landmass he had heard about to the west. And when he returned to Iceland, he had a clever marketing plan. He told the other Icelanders about the new land, but he gave it a rather attractive name to entice more settlers: Greenland. A little bit of spin to get people excited, you know. It's like calling a barren desert the oasis of perpetual sunshine to sell real estate. The saga of Eric the Red and the settlement of Greenland is a wonderful example of Viking ingenuity and stubbornness. In 986, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships from Iceland, carrying a few hundred settlers, their families, and their livestock. Only 14 of those ships made it, a stark reminder of the dangers of North Atlantic travel. The rest were either lost at sea or turned back. But the hardy souls who did arrive found a land that, while not exactly green, had fertile fjords and good pasture land for a few hundred kilometers along the southwestern coast. It was here, in 2 main areas they called the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, that the Norse established their new home. Life in Greenland was incredibly tough. It was a marginal existence, a constant battle against the cold, the ice, and the long, dark winters. The settlers' economy was based on farming and hunting. They raised sheep and cattle in the sheltered fjords, but the real money came from hunting. They hunted seals, walruses, and polar bears, and the products of these hunts were their main exports. Walrus ivory, in particular, was highly prized in Europe and was their primary source of income. This ivory, along with polar bear pelts, was their connection to the wider European world, the only thing that made their isolated life economically viable. For centuries, the Norse settlements in Greenland thrived, or at least they survived. They built farms, churches, and even a cathedral. They had a law speaker and an Althing, just like in Iceland, and they maintained close ties with Norway and Iceland. But around the 14th century, a subtle and then not so subtle decline began. And here is one of the greatest open mysteries of medieval history. What happened to the Norse in Greenland? By the early 15th century, they had simply vanished. When later European expeditions arrived in the area, the Norse settlements were gone. The farms were abandoned, the churches were in ruins, and there was no one left to tell the tale. Scholars have been debating this for centuries. The traditional theory, the one you probably heard growing up, is climate change. Around the 14th century, the climate in the North Atlantic began to cool down, a period known as the Little Ice Age. This would have made farming and livestock raising much more difficult. The sea ice would have increased, making travel and hunting more dangerous. The trade routes to Europe would have become more treacherous, cutting them off from their main source of income. The walrus ivory trade, in particular, was also hit by the growing popularity of elephant ivory from Africa, which was of a higher quality and easier to get. It's a compelling theory, a story of a small, isolated community being slowly choked to death by the elements and changing markets. But there are other ideas too. Some historians point to a decline in political and social cohesion. Others suggest a gradual assimilation with the indigenous Inuit people, who are much better adapted to the Arctic climate. We know from archaeological evidence that there was some contact between the Norse and the Inuit, whom the Norse called Skrællingar. Initially, this contact seems to have been hostile, with sagas describing armed conflict. But some scholars suggest that over time, a more peaceful exchange might have occurred, with the Norse eventually intermarrying with and being absorbed into the more dominant Inuit culture. It's a peaceful and satisfying theory, but there's very little hard evidence to support it. Another, more recent, theory suggests that the settlers simply chose to leave. As the climate worsened and the trade dried up, the younger generations might have simply decided that Greenland was no longer a viable place to live and migrated back to Iceland or Norway. The final desperate voyage of the last Greenlanders might not have been a tragedy, but a calculated decision to save themselves. We may never know for sure what happened, but the image of those abandoned farms and silent churches, standing as lonely sentinels against the ice, remains one of the most powerful and haunting legacies of the Viking Age. The story of Eric the Red's Greenlanders is a beautiful, tragic tale of courage and resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to survive in the harshest of conditions, and a stark reminder that even the most determined settlements can be swallowed by the cold, indifferent march of history. While some Vikings were sailing west to the chilly, isolated fjords of Iceland and Greenland, others were looking in the complete opposite direction, following the rivers of Eastern Europe deep into the continent's heartland. This was a different kind of Viking journey, less about raid and more about trade. These were the Swedes, or at least the Swedes and other Norsemen, who are collectively known as the Russ in the historical record. They were drawn by the promise of exotic goods and the wealth of the great trading cities of the Byzantine and Arab worlds. Their journey would be long and arduous, and it would lay the foundation for one of the most powerful and enduring states in Eastern European history, the Kievan Rus. The Rus Vikings' journey began on the Baltic Sea. From there, they would navigate the vast river systems of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. They would travel down the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Dvina rivers, carrying their longboats and their goods over long stretches of land, a practice known as portaging. It was a perilous journey, filled with hostile tribes, dangerous rapids, and long, grueling portages where they would have to carry their ships on their shoulders. Imagine being a Viking, used to sailing on open water, and suddenly having to drag a 3-ton boat for miles through a forest. It's a workout that would make a modern CrossFitter weep, but the rewards were immense. The rivers were the great superhighways of the medieval world, and they led to the great trading centers of the East. The Rus traded in furs, honey, wax, and yes, slaves. In return, they got silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, silks and spices from the Byzantine Empire, and fine metalwork from Central Asia. The sheer volume of silver that flowed into Scandinavia through these trade routes is staggering. Archaeologists have found hoards of Arabic silver coins called dirhams, all over Scandinavia, a quiet testament to the scale of this Eastern trade. It's a great piece of historical irony that the same people who were raiding Christian monasteries for gold were also trading peacefully with the Muslim world for silver. Now, here's a delicious little historiographical debate for you. The question of who the Rus actually were has been a point of contention for centuries. The traditional view, supported by early Russian chronicles like the Primary Chronicle, is that the Rus were a group of Vikings, specifically Swedes, who were invited by the local Slavic tribes to come and rule over them. The chronicle tells the story of a chieftain named Rurik, who, along with his brothers, was invited to rule Novgorod in 862. Rurik's descendants then went on to conquer Kiev and establish the Kievan Rus' state. This is a powerful and very nationalistic origin story for Russia and Ukraine. However, some scholars, particularly in Russia and Ukraine, have long argued for a different theory, suggesting that the Rus were not Vikings at all, but rather a local Slavic tribe. This is known as the anti-Normanist theory, and it's a debate that is often tinged with political and nationalistic overtones. The historical and archaeological evidence, however, strongly points to a Scandinavian origin. The names of the early Rus rulers, like Igor, Oleg, and Olga, are all Slavicized versions of Old Norse names, like Ingvar, Helgi, and Helga. The archaeological evidence, from burial mounds to weapons and jewelry, also shows a strong Scandinavian presence in the early Rus settlements. It's a bit like a modern historian finding a bunch of artifacts in New York City from 100 different countries and saying, "Nope, the city was founded by the local wildlife." It just doesn't add up. The Kievan Rus' state that the Rus Vikings established became a major power in the region, a crossroads of different cultures and peoples. The Rus rulers, while Viking in origin, quickly adopted many of the local Slavic customs and language, and they eventually converted to Orthodox Christianity. The most famous example of this is Vladimir the Great, a ruler who, according to the chronicle, sent envoys to different countries to check out their religions before finally settling on Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium. It's a very practical, very Viking way of converting, isn't it? Just do a little research and pick the best one. The Kievan Rus would go on to be a powerful and influential state for centuries, a lasting legacy of a few ambitious Swedes who decided to take the scenic route to the east. As the Rus Vikings were establishing a powerful state on the great rivers of Eastern Europe, another group of Norse warriors was making their way to the ultimate prize, Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. They didn't come as raiders, at least not at first. They came as mercenaries, drawn by the promise of wealth and glory. The Byzantines, with their vast wealth and complex politics, had a long history of employing foreign soldiers to fight their battles. And they soon discovered that the Norsemen, with their fierce fighting style and unwavering loyalty, once they were paid, made for an excellent addition to their imperial army. The group of Norse warriors who served the Byzantine emperor became known as the Varangian Guard. The name Varangian comes from the Old Norse word varar, meaning pledge or oath, which reflects the personal oath of loyalty they swore to the emperor himself. These weren't just any soldiers. They were the emperor's personal bodyguard, his elite shock troops. They stood guard in the imperial palace. They marched alongside the emperor in parades, and they were deployed in the most difficult and dangerous battles. The Byzantines respected their fighting prowess, and the emperor knew he could trust them because, unlike the local Byzantine troops, they had no local political ties and no ambition to seize the throne for themselves. Their loyalty was to the man who paid them. The Varangian Guard was a multicultural force, a true melting pot of medieval warriors. While it was initially dominated by Norsemen, it also included Anglo-Saxons who had fled England after the Norman conquest in 1066. Imagine a group of Anglo-Saxons, fresh from their defeat at the Battle of Hastings, deciding to get as far away from the Normans as possible, and ending up in Constantinople, fighting alongside the descendants of the Vikings who had tormented them for centuries. It's a great piece of historical irony, a story that almost writes itself. The Varangian Guard, in a way, was the ultimate what-if scenario for those who lost their homeland. One of the most famous Varangians was a man named Harald Hardrada, a future king of Norway. Before he became king, Harald was a young man with a bit of a problem back home, so he fled to Constantinople and joined the Guard. He quickly rose through the ranks, serving with distinction in campaigns in Sicily and Bulgaria. The sagas describe him as an incredibly skilled and ruthless warrior, a man who was as clever as he was brave. But like many high-ranking officials in the Byzantine court, he eventually ran afoul of the emperor. The sagas claim he fell in love with a noblewoman and was imprisoned by the empress, and had to escape in a daring plot. He eventually fled Constantinople, but not before, according to some sources, he plundered the imperial treasury just to add a bit of Viking flair to his departure. This story of Harald is a beautiful example of a historiographical mystery. The Byzantine sources, which are more reliable, tell a different story. They say he was accused of misappropriating funds and was imprisoned, but they don't mention any romantic subplot or dramatic escape. The sagas, on the other hand, love a good story and a bit of drama. So which one is right? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The sagas likely embellished the events to make Harald seem more heroic and romantic, while the Byzantine sources might have downplayed his importance. What we do know for sure is that Harald Hardrada returned to Norway a wealthy and powerful man, a testament to the riches that could be gained from service in Constantinople. The Varangian Guard served the Byzantine emperors for centuries, their reputation as fearsome fighters growing with each generation. They were known for their distinctive weapons, particularly their large two-handed axes, which were said to be able to cut through chainmail with a single blow. The Byzantines, who were used to a more Roman style of warfare, were probably a bit taken aback by these burly Northmen with their wild beards and even wilder fighting styles. But they were effective, and that's all that mattered. The legacy of the Varangian Guard is immense. They were a bridge between the Norse world and the glittering, sophisticated world of Byzantium. They brought back stories, ideas, and most importantly, wealth. The influx of Byzantine gold and silver into Scandinavia had a huge impact on the region's economy and social structure. It helped powerful chieftains consolidate their power and build impressive halls and churches. The Varangian Guard was more than just a military unit. It was a conduit for cultural and economic exchange, a fascinating example of how two very different worlds could connect in the most unexpected of ways. We've been talking a lot about raids, trade, and settlement, but a massive shift was happening beneath the surface of Scandinavian society. A change that was far more profound and long-lasting than any military victory. This was the gradual and often violent conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity. For centuries, the Norse had worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses. Odin, the one-eyed all-father, Thor, the hammer-wielding god of thunder, and Freya, the goddess of love and war. Their world was one of fierce gods, honorable death in battle, and the glorious halls of Valhalla. But a new god was on the horizon, a gentle carpenter from a distant land, and his followers were spreading his message with a combination of persuasion, politics, and a good old-fashioned dose of coercion. The conversion wasn't a sudden event. It was a long, messy process that unfolded over several centuries, starting in the 9th century and not really being complete until the 12th. The first exposure to Christianity came through trade and raiding. The Vikings would have seen Christian symbols and heard Christian prayers in the places they visited, and some would have even brought back Christian artifacts. But these were just trinkets and curiosities. They didn't represent a serious challenge to the old beliefs. The real shift began with political contact. Remember how the Franks were trying to push Christianity north? They saw it as a way to civilize their neighbors and make them less prone to raiding. Missionaries, like the famous Saint Ansgars, were sent to Denmark and Sweden in the 9th century, but their success was limited at best. They were allowed to preach, but they didn't make a lot of converts. It's hard to sell a religion of peace to a society that thrives on war, isn't it? The real turning point came when Scandinavian kings started to realize the political benefits of converting. A Christian king could align himself with the powerful Christian monarchs of Europe, gaining access to their wealth, their military support, and their diplomatic networks. A Christian king was seen as more legitimate, more civilized, and more trustworthy. The conversion, in essence, was a form of political and economic modernization. It was a way for Scandinavian rulers to bring their kingdoms out of the periphery and into the mainstream of European politics. It was a very practical decision, a bit like a small company deciding to go public to get access to more capital and a better reputation, but the conversion was far from peaceful. It was a clash of two very different worldviews. The old beliefs were deeply ingrained in the culture. The gods were a part of everyday life, and the rituals and sacrifices were a part of the social fabric. The new Christian faith, with its single, all-powerful God and its emphasis on submission and humility, was a radical departure. The sagas are full of stories of this conflict, of kings and chieftains who tried to force their new religion on their people, often with bloody results. A particularly famous story is that of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, a man we'll talk more about in the next section, who, according to the sagas, would travel around his kingdom, giving people a choice: convert to Christianity or be killed. It's not exactly the kind of missionary work you read about in Sunday school. The conversion also led to a fascinating period of syncretism, where the old and new beliefs were mixed together. For a long time, people would worship both the old gods and the new God. They would be baptized as Christians, but they would still make sacrifices to Thor for a good harvest or a safe journey. We have archaeological evidence of this, with graves containing both a Christian cross and a pendant of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. This dual belief system was a way for people to hedge their bets, to get the political benefits of Christianity while still holding on to the old traditions that had served them for so long. It was a pragmatic, very Scandinavian approach to a theological problem. And here's a really interesting scholarly debate. Was the Christianization of Scandinavia a top-down or a bottom-up process? Did it start with the kings and slowly trickle down to the people? Or did it start with traders and settlers and bubble up to the rulers? The truth is, it was probably both. It was a complex, messy process, with different parts of Scandinavia converting at different times and in different ways. Denmark, with its close ties to the Frankish Empire, was Christianized relatively early. Norway, with its more rugged and isolated geography, took longer. And Sweden, with its powerful pagan cult center at Uppsala, was the last holdout. It was a long, slow goodbye to the old gods, a farewell to a worldview that had defined a people for millennia, and it would fundamentally change the course of Scandinavian history forever. The story of Norway's conversion and its unification is a tale woven with the threads of ambition, violence, and religious zeal. For a long time, Norway was a land of independent chieftains, a patchwork of small warring kingdoms. But as we saw, this was a time of change, of powerful men trying to forge larger, more centralized states. The man who is traditionally credited with the first unification of Norway is Harald Fairhair, a king we mentioned earlier, who drove many of the independent-minded chieftains to settle Iceland. But Harald's unification was a fragile one, and after his death, the country reverted to its old ways. It would take a few more centuries, and a few more charismatic and ruthless kings to finally bring the country together for good. The most famous of these unifying kings, and a central figure in the story of Norway's conversion, was Olaf Tryggvason. According to the sagas, Olaf was a larger-than-life figure, a man of immense strength and charisma, who had spent his youth as a Viking raider and a mercenary. He had traveled all over the Viking world, from the Baltic to England, and had even served in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. The sagas claim that he converted to Christianity while in England, after a hermit prophesied that he would become king of Norway. Whether the prophecy was real or just a clever bit of political theater, it worked. Olaf returned to Norway in 995, and with the support of a group of powerful chieftains, he was proclaimed king. Olaf's reign was a whirlwind of activity, all aimed at two goals: unifying Norway under his rule and converting the entire country to Christianity. He was a force of nature, a man who saw no distinction between political power and religious authority. His method of conversion, as we touched on earlier, was simple and brutally effective. Give people the choice between baptism or death. He would travel from region to region, holding a thing or assembly, and demanding that the local chieftains and their people convert. The sagas are full of stories of him destroying pagan temples, seizing the property of those who refused to convert, and even, in one particularly gruesome story, forcing a chieftain to eat a snake and a spider as a form of Christian penance. It's a bit much for a bedtime story, but it gives you a sense of the man's uncompromising nature. Olaf's most famous act of conversion came when he built a new capital city, a place he named Nidaros, which would later become modern-day Trondheim. He built a beautiful wooden church there and made it the center of his new Christian kingdom. But his attempts to force a new religion on a proud and independent people eventually led to his downfall. He made a lot of enemies, both Christian and pagan, and they eventually conspired against him. In the year 1000, he was ambushed at sea by a combined fleet of his enemies, led by the Danish king Svein Forkbeard and the Swedish king Olaf Skjøtkonung. The ensuing naval battle, the Battle of Svolder, is one of the most famous events in Viking history. The sagas describe the battle in epic detail. Olaf's ship, the Ormenlange or Long Serpent, was the largest and most beautiful ship of its time. But he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The battle was a bloody affair, and when it became clear that all was lost, Olaf, rather than surrender, is said to have jumped into the sea and vanished, never to be seen again. His death was the end of his short but impactful reign, and Norway was once again partitioned between Denmark and Sweden. Now, here's a little historical head-scratcher. The location of the Battle of Svolder is still a complete mystery. The sagas describe it as being fought in a bay, but they don't say which one. Scholars have proposed dozens of different locations, from the Danish coast to the Swedish archipelago. The truth is, we probably will never know for sure, and that's okay. The battle, whether it happened exactly as the sagas describe or not, became a powerful symbol of a man who was willing to die for his beliefs, and his story became a cornerstone of Norwegian national identity. Olaf Tryggvason's legacy, despite his failure to hold on to the throne and his brutal methods, was immense. He laid the groundwork for a truly unified and Christian Norway. The next king to continue his work, another Olaf, Olaf Haraldsson, would finish the job and would, after his death, become Norway's patron saint. But it was Olaf Tryggvason who set the wheels in motion, a man who, in his short reign, managed to drag a country, kicking and screaming, into the Christian world, and in doing so, created the foundations of the Norwegian kingdom that would endure for centuries. While Olaf Tryggvason was busy trying to drag Norway into the Christian world, his Danish and Swedish counterparts were equally busy, but on a much grander scale. Denmark, in particular, was positioning itself to be a major power in the North Sea, and the man who would take them to the pinnacle of this power was a king named Knut the Great. Knut's story is a fascinating one, a beautiful example of how the Viking Age was transitioning from one of small-scale raiding to large-scale dynastic empire building. He wasn't just a king. He was a master of political maneuvering, a skilled military commander, and a surprisingly effective ruler. The story really begins with Knut's father, Svein Forkbeard, the man who helped defeat Olaf Tryggvason at the Battle of Svolder. Svein was a formidable warrior and a clever politician. He had already conquered and briefly ruled England, only to have to flee when the Anglo-Saxons rose up against him. But he had paved the way for his son. When Svein died, his son Knut, a young man who had been with his father on his campaigns, took up the mantle. Knut had a problem, though. The English throne had reverted to its old Anglo-Saxon king, Ethelred the Unready, a man whose nickname tells you a lot about his leadership style. Knut was not about to let go of his father's claims so easily. So, Knut launched a massive invasion of England in 1015. It was a well-organized, well-funded campaign, a testament to the resources and power of the Danish kingdom at the time. Knut's forces were a mix of Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish warriors, a truly Scandinavian army. He fought a long and brutal war against Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, a man who, unlike his father, was a very capable general. But the war ended in a stalemate, and the two men agreed to divide England between them. Unfortunately for Edmund, he died a few weeks later under mysterious circumstances, leaving Nut as the sole ruler of England. A lot of lucky breaks, or perhaps not so lucky breaks for his opponents, seemed to follow Nut around. Once he had control of England, Nut did something that was truly remarkable. Instead of ruling it as a conquered territory, he governed it with a surprising degree of competence and sensitivity. He didn't just impose Danish law, he respected Anglo-Saxon traditions and even issued his own law codes that were based on existing English law. He kept many of the Anglo-Saxon noblemen in their positions and, in a truly clever move, married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, thus linking himself to the old English royal family and to the Normans. He was, in a way, the ultimate political chameleon, a man who could be a fearsome Viking warrior one day and a pious, English-style king the next. But Knut's ambitions didn't stop at England. After his brother died, he became king of Denmark, and he soon turned his attention to Norway. He fought against the Norwegian king, Olaf Haraldsson, and with the help of some disgruntled Norwegian chieftains, he drove him from the country and became king of Norway as well. And just like that, Knut had forged a massive and impressive empire, a trifecta of England, Denmark, and Norway, a dominion that historians call the North Sea Empire. It was a short-lived empire, lasting only as long as Knut lived, but for a brief moment in the 11th century, the North Sea was essentially a Danish lake. The North Sea Empire was a marvel of medieval statecraft. Knut, a man who had started his life as a Viking prince, was now a powerful Christian monarch, a man who ruled over a vast and diverse realm. He was a great patron of the church, funding the building of monasteries and traveling to Rome on pilgrimage. He even, according to a famous story that is probably apocryphal, but still a great anecdote, sat on his throne at the edge of the sea and commanded the tides to stop, a demonstration to his fawning courtiers that a king's power, unlike God's, was limited. It's a nice story that shows his self-awareness and perhaps his sense of humor. Knut the Great died in 1035, and his empire, which had been held together by his personal genius and charisma, quickly fell apart. His sons were not of the same caliber, and within a decade, the three kingdoms were once again separate. But Knut's reign was a powerful sign of things to come. It showed that the Viking Age, which had started with small-scale raiding, was now capable of producing vast, multinational empires. The focus was no longer on plunder, but on political control and dynastic succession. The Vikings were no longer just a threat from the sea. They were a part of the European political establishment, while Denmark and Norway were busy with their North Sea Empire. Sweden was playing a different, but no less important, role in the Viking story. Sweden's geography and location meant that its focus was not on the British Isles, but on the vast forested lands to the east and the rich trading routes of the Baltic Sea. The Swedish Vikings, the Rus, were the master traders of the East, establishing long-distance trade networks that stretched all the way to Byzantium and the Arab world. But their influence wasn't limited to the Kievan Rus. They were also the dominant force in the Baltic, a kind of medieval trade and conquest powerhouse. The main hub of this eastern trade was a place called Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren, near modern-day Stockholm. Birka was a bustling, multicultural town, a true crossroads of the medieval world. Archaeologists have found a treasure trove of artifacts there, including coins from the Islamic world, glass beads from Byzantium, and jewelry from the Slavic lands. It was a place where merchants from all over the world came to trade with the Swedes. The Swedes, in turn, offered them a wealth of goods, particularly furs from the vast forests of the north, honey, and of course, slaves. Birka was the ultimate party, a lively, chaotic, and very profitable city. But here's a little historical head-scratcher for you: the fate of Birka. Around the late 10th century, the city was suddenly abandoned. We don't know exactly why. The traditional theory is that a shift in the lake's water levels made the harbor unusable, forcing the inhabitants to move. But other scholars suggest that it might have been a political decision, perhaps a result of the consolidation of royal power and the rise of other trading centers, like Sigtuna. The mystery of Birka's abandonment is a good reminder that even the most bustling cities can, for reasons we may never fully understand, just disappear. The Swedes, however, didn't disappear, and their influence in the Baltic only grew. A powerful force that helped to shape Sweden's influence in the Baltic was Gotland, a large island that was a major trading hub in its own right. The Gotlanders were renowned merchants, and their fleets of ships crisscrossed the Baltic, trading with everyone from the Slavs on the southern coast to the peoples of the eastern Baltic. The Gotlanders, with their wealth and their trading networks, were a crucial part of the Swedish sphere of influence. They were, in a way, the merchant bankers of the Viking world. Their legacy can still be seen today in the form of thousands of runestones found on the island, many of them commemorating merchants who had traveled far and wide. The Swedes' influence wasn't just about trade. They were also masters of warfare and colonization in the eastern Baltic. They launched raids and expeditions into what is now Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. These weren't just raids for plunder. They were also about establishing control and extracting tribute. The Swedes, with their well-organized fleets and their superior weapons, were a dominant military force in the region. The legacy of these campaigns can be seen in the historical records of the time, which speak of Swedish rulers and chieftains dominating the local peoples. But Sweden's unification into a single cohesive kingdom was a much slower and messier process than in Denmark or Norway. For a long time, the country was a collection of different lands or provinces, each with its own local laws and traditions. The most important of these were Svealand, in the central part of the country, and Götaland, in the south. The kings of Sweden had to be elected by the men of both these regions, and their authority was often limited. It was a bit like a medieval version of a federal republic, with the central government having to constantly negotiate with the local states. The main sticking point in this unification was the long and difficult conversion to Christianity. Remember how Denmark and Norway had kings who were eager to convert for political reasons. Sweden had a much harder time. The central pagan cult at Uppsala was a powerful force, and the kings who tried to force a conversion often faced a backlash. It wasn't until the 12th century that Christianity finally became the dominant religion. And even then, the old traditions and beliefs lingered for a long time. This slow conversion, combined with the lack of a single unifying enemy like the Franks or the Anglo-Saxons, meant that Sweden's political development was a bit of a slow burn. But it was a slow burn that eventually led to a very powerful and influential kingdom, one that would come to dominate the Baltic and play a major role in the later history of Europe. As we've seen, the Viking Age was a period of intense activity and incredible change. But all eras, no matter how dynamic, eventually come to an end. The end of the Viking Age wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event. It was a slow, gradual winding down, a transition from an age of raiding and exploration to an age of more centralized kingdoms and European integration. The year 1066 is often cited as the symbolic end of the era, and for good reason. It was the year of a series of monumental events that effectively closed the book on the Viking phenomenon. First, let's talk about the man who, in many ways, was the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, the same guy who served in the Varangian Guard and plundered the imperial treasury of Byzantium. After his time in Constantinople, he returned to Norway a wealthy and powerful man, and eventually became king. But he was a man of ambition, and he set his sights on the most glittering prize of all, the throne of England. Remember how Knut the Great's North Sea Empire had fallen apart? Well, the English throne was now in a state of chaos, with several contenders vying for it. One of them was Harald Hardrada. So in 1066, Harald Hardrada, a man who was arguably a living legend of the Viking world, launched a massive invasion of England. He landed in the north with a huge army and initially had great success, defeating a local English army at the Battle of Fulford. But his triumph was short-lived. The English king, a man named Harold Godwinson, force-marched his army north from London in an incredible display of military speed and logistics, and caught Harald Hardrada completely by surprise at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The battle was a bloody affair, and Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking warriors, was killed. His army was completely destroyed, and the Viking Age, at least in England, was over. But the story doesn't end there. Just 3 days after his victory, Harold Godwinson had to turn his army around and march south again, because another contender for the English throne had just landed on the southern coast, William, Duke of Normandy. William, as we know, was a descendant of the Viking chieftain Rollo, the same man who was given land by the Frankish king to stop the Viking raids. The battle between Harold Godwinson and William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings is one of the most famous in history, and it ended with Harold's death and William's victory. The Norman conquest of England was, in a strange way, the ultimate legacy of the Vikings. It was a Viking-descended ruler who finally conquered England for good, bringing a new culture and a new dynasty to the island. So 1066 is a great symbolic end date. But the end of the Viking Age was caused by more than just these two battles. There were a number of other factors at play. One of the most important was the rise of strong centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia itself. The kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had, by this time, largely consolidated their power. They had standing armies, they had tax systems, and they had a clear succession plan. They no longer needed to raid for wealth. They could get it through taxation and trade. The raiding lifestyle, which had once been a way for ambitious young men to get rich and famous, was now actively discouraged by the kings, who saw it as a threat to their authority and their carefully cultivated relationships with their Christian neighbors. Another factor was the gradual and irreversible Christianization of Scandinavia. As the Norse converted, their worldview changed. The idea of dying in battle and going to Valhalla was replaced by the Christian concept of heaven and hell. The church, with its emphasis on peace and order, was a powerful force against the old, violent Viking lifestyle. The kings, now with the support of the church, were able to use Christian ideology to legitimize their rule and to bring an end to the blood feuds and petty wars that had defined the earlier era. The church, in a way, was the ultimate civilizing force, so the Viking Age didn't just end, it evolved. The fierce pagan warriors of the 8th century had, by the 11th century, become Christian kings, traders, and farmers. Their culture had been fundamentally changed by their contact with the rest of Europe. Their longships, which had once been used for raiding and exploration, were now used for trade and military campaigns. The Viking spirit of adventure and courage didn't disappear, but it was channeled into new, more constructive forms. It was the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new one, a period where Scandinavia would take its place as a part of the greater European community. With the Viking Age now fading into memory, a new era was dawning in Scandinavia, one of political consolidation and the slow but steady emergence of the 3 distinct kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This period, from the late 11th century to the late 13th century, is often called the High Middle Ages. It was a time of immense internal development, as the Scandinavian rulers worked to solidify their power, establish stable institutions, and create a sense of national identity. The old decentralized world of independent chieftains was being replaced by a more structured monarchical society, and it was a messy, often violent process. Let's start with Denmark, the kingdom that had, for a brief time, been the center of Knut the Great's North Sea Empire. Denmark's proximity to continental Europe meant it was the first of the 3 kingdoms to fully embrace the European model of monarchy. The Danish kings, with their close ties to the German Holy Roman Empire and the Church, were able to build a powerful and wealthy state. They established a system of feudalism, with the king at the top and a class of noblemen and knights beneath him, all loyal to the crown. The Church also played a huge role, becoming a major landowner and a powerful political force. The kings used the Church to legitimize their rule and to bring a sense of order to the country, but Denmark's road to consolidation was far from smooth. The 12th century, in particular, was a period of intense civil war and power struggles. The kings often had to contend with rival claimants to the throne and with powerful noble families who wanted to limit the king's power. It was a bit like the TV show Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and more muddy battlefields. The man who finally brought a sense of lasting stability to Denmark was King Valdemar III, known as the Great. He and his son, Valdemar II, known as the Victorious, were able to crush the internal opposition and to expand Danish territory, conquering parts of the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. For a while, Denmark was a true regional power, a formidable force that controlled trade and politics in the entire Baltic region. In Norway, the process of consolidation was a bit different. Norway's geography, with its long, rugged coastline and its isolated fjords, meant that a centralized government was much harder to establish. The country was still, in many ways, a collection of local communities, each with its own customs and traditions. The kings of Norway, like the famous Sverre Sigurdsson, a man who, according to his saga, claimed to be an illegitimate son of a previous king and led a long, bloody civil war, had to constantly fight to assert their authority. The conflict between the kings and the chieftains, and between different factions of the nobility, was a defining feature of Norwegian politics for centuries. But a turning point came in the 13th century, with the reign of King Haakon IV, Haakon's. Haakon was a powerful and canny ruler who managed to finally bring a sense of peace to the country. He built a strong navy, centralized the administration, and even established a formal legal code for the entire country. Under his rule, Norway reached the peak of its medieval power, a period of prosperity and cultural flourishing. Haakon even established diplomatic ties with the Mongols, sending an embassy to their court in the hope of an alliance. It's an incredible thought. A Norwegian king and a Mongol Khan. A bit like a modern-day summit between two very different worlds. Sweden, as we've already seen, was a bit of a slow burn. The country was still a divided land, with powerful, independent lands that resisted the authority of a central king. The kings of Sweden were often weak and had to constantly deal with internal rebellions and conflicts. It wasn't until the mid-13th century that a powerful nobleman named Birger Jarl was able to finally bring a sense of unity to the country. Birger Jarl, though never king himself, was the de facto ruler of Sweden for many years. He founded the city of Stockholm, established a new capital, and led a series of successful military campaigns that solidified Swedish control over Finland. He was a brilliant administrator and a ruthless politician, the kind of man who gets things done, even if he has to break a few eggs to make an omelette. The High Middle Ages in Scandinavia was a period of intense development, with the three kingdoms slowly but surely evolving into the powerful states they are today. The old pagan, raiding culture of the Vikings was replaced by a new Christian monarchical culture. The three kingdoms, with their distinct histories and their unique geographical challenges, were all on their own path to becoming modern states. They had their own kings, their own legal codes, and their own sense of national pride, and they were ready to take their place on the European stage. As the Scandinavian kingdoms moved into the High Middle Ages, they began to look less like their Viking ancestors and more like their European counterparts. This was a period of profound social and economic change. The old agrarian society of independent farmers and chieftains was being replaced by a more complex, hierarchical system. Towns and cities began to grow, trade expanded, and a new class of powerful noblemen and merchants emerged, all of which had a huge impact on the lives of ordinary people. One of the most significant changes was the rise of towns and urban life. While the Viking Age had a few important trading centers like Birka, these were nothing like the bustling, fortified cities that began to emerge in the High Middle Ages. Cities like Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo became centers of commerce, administration, and religion. They were home to merchants, craftsmen, and priests, and they were a place where new ideas and new technologies could take root. The growth of these cities was a direct result of the consolidation of royal power. Kings needed administrative centers to collect taxes, enforce laws, and manage their growing kingdoms. They also needed to protect their trade routes, which meant building fortified towns and castles. This growth in towns was accompanied by a huge expansion in trade. The Baltic Sea, which had been a Viking trade route for centuries, was now a bustling superhighway of commerce. Scandinavian merchants, many of them now organized into trade guilds, were trading with everyone from the English and the Dutch to the Germans and the Russians. They were exporting fish, furs, timber, and iron, and they were importing luxury goods like wines, spices, and silks. The wealth generated by this trade had a huge impact on the Scandinavian economy, allowing kings to build impressive cathedrals and castles, and noblemen to live in a style that would have been unimaginable to their Viking ancestors. The social structure was also changing. The old system of a few powerful chieftains and a mass of free farmers was being replaced by a more formal, feudal-style hierarchy. At the top was the king, and beneath him was a new class of powerful noblemen who held their lands in exchange for military service. This was a major shift. In the Viking Age, a man's status was often measured by his personal charisma and his ability to lead men in battle. In the High Middle Ages, it was increasingly measured by the amount of land he owned and his relationship to the king. The noblemen, with their impressive stone castles and their armies of knights, were a new and powerful force in Scandinavian society. But here's a really interesting scholarly debate. To what extent did Scandinavia actually have a feudal system? In places like France and England, the feudal system was a very rigid, well-defined system of land ownership and military obligation. In Scandinavia, it was much more fluid and less formal. The kings often had to contend with a class of free farmers who still owned their own land and had a voice in local assemblies. The nobility was also not as numerous or as powerful as in other parts of Europe. So, while Scandinavia was moving towards a more hierarchical system, it was doing so in its own unique way, retaining some of the democratic traditions of the old Viking world. The church also played a massive role in this social and economic transformation. The establishment of dioceses and the building of cathedrals meant that the church was now a major landowner and a powerful institution in its own right. The church provided a sense of spiritual and social unity, and it also introduced new ideas and new technologies from the rest of Europe. Monasteries, in particular, were centers of learning, art, and agriculture, and they helped to spread new farming techniques and new architectural styles. The building of the incredible cathedrals of Lund and Nidaros, for example, would have been impossible without the knowledge and the resources that the church brought to the region. So the High Middle Ages in Scandinavia was a period of incredible growth and change. The Viking Age, with its focus on raiding and exploration, was over. In its place was a new world of towns, trade, and powerful kingdoms. The Scandinavian people were no longer just a threat from the sea. They were now an integral part of the European community. They had their own kings, their own noblemen, and their own churches. And they were building a society that would, in many ways, be a bridge between the old Viking world and the modern states we know today. As the three Scandinavian kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden solidified their individual identities, a new and powerful idea began to emerge: the possibility of a political union. The 14th century was a period of immense change and turmoil in Europe. The Black Death had swept through the continent, decimating the population and upending the social order. The three Scandinavian kingdoms were all grappling with internal power struggles and a growing external threat from the Hanseatic League, a powerful German trading confederation. In this chaotic environment, a remarkable woman would emerge who would, through a combination of political genius and relentless ambition, unite the three kingdoms into a single, powerful state. This was the genesis of the Kalmar Union. The union was born out of a series of crises, not a sudden desire for unity. The male lines of the royal houses of all three kingdoms were, one by one, dying out creating succession crises. The powerful noblemen of each kingdom were also looking for a way to maintain their power and to protect their interests against the growing power of the Hanseatic League. It was a classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. And the enemy was a powerful and very rich trading league from Germany. The central figure in this story, the one who pulled all the strings and made it happen, was a woman named Margaret Pershny of Denmark. Margaret was a queen of immense talent and ambition, a woman who, in an age dominated by men, was the most powerful ruler in Europe. She was the daughter of the Danish king Valdemar Thord, and she was a natural leader, a master of diplomacy and political maneuvering. She had been married to the King of Norway, and their son, Olaf, was the heir to both the Danish and Norwegian thrones. But Olaf died young, and Margaret, instead of stepping aside, made a bold move. She had her grandnephew, a boy named Eric, proclaimed King of Norway and Denmark. But she ruled in his name as the de facto monarch. But Margaret's ambition didn't stop there. Sweden was, at the time, ruled by a German-born king, Albert of Mecklenburg, who was widely unpopular with the Swedish nobility. The Swedish nobles, tired of Albert's misrule and his favoritism towards German nobles, offered Margaret the throne. Margaret, sensing a golden opportunity, invaded Sweden with a Danish and Norwegian army. In 1389, she defeated King Albert's forces at the Battle of Oslo and took him prisoner. With that victory, Margaret became the ruler of all three Scandinavian kingdoms. Now she had to make it official. In 1397, Margaret orchestrated a great meeting of the Scandinavian nobles and bishops in the town of Kalmar in Sweden. Here, her grandnephew Eric was crowned king of all three kingdoms, and a treaty was signed, establishing the Kalmar Union. The union was a personal union of the three crowns under one monarch. Each kingdom was to remain a separate entity with its own laws and institutions, but they were to be united under a single king or queen. The goal was to create a united front against the Hanseatic League and the growing influence of Germany. It was a beautiful and in many ways very modern idea for its time. A political alliance that was designed to protect the sovereignty and interests of the member states. But here's a really interesting scholarly debate. What was the true nature of the Kalmar Union? Was it an equal partnership, as the treaty claimed, or was it a Danish-dominated empire? The truth is, it was probably the latter. Margaret, for all her genius, was first and foremost a Danish queen, and she tended to favor Danish nobles and Danish interests. The union was administered from Copenhagen, and the Danish king was always the head of the union. This, of course, caused a lot of resentment in Sweden, and to a lesser extent, in Norway. The Swedes, in particular, felt that they were being treated as a junior partner, and this resentment would be a constant source of tension and conflict for the entire duration of the union. But for a brief, shining moment, Margaret had achieved something truly remarkable. She had united a vast and diverse region, a territory that stretched from Greenland to Finland, and she had done so with a combination of military might and political cunning. The Kalmar Union was her lasting legacy, a testament to her genius and her ambition. It was a period of both peace and prosperity, but it was also a period of internal tension and conflict, a complex and fascinating chapter in the history of Scandinavia. We left off with Margaret I of Denmark, the masterful queen who, through a combination of political cunning and military force, had forged the Kalmar Union, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown. But while the union was officially established in 1397, Margaret's personal genius was what truly held it together. The period of her de facto rule was one of relative stability and prosperity. She was a brilliant administrator, and she managed to balance the competing interests of the noblemen and the towns in all three kingdoms. She was also a brilliant diplomat, and she used the combined power of the Union to successfully contain the threat from the Hanseatic League and the German princes. She was a true monarch of the old school, a woman who could be both ruthless and pragmatic, and her reign was, in many ways, the high watermark of the Kalmar Union. But Margaret was an irreplaceable force, and after her death in 1412, the Union began to face a series of challenges that would slowly but surely tear it apart. Her successor was her grandnephew, Eric of Pomerania, the same boy she had had crowned as king. Eric, however, was not Margaret. He lacked her political acumen and her ability to compromise. He was a much more heavy-handed and ambitious ruler, and he quickly began to alienate the nobility in all three kingdoms, but especially in Sweden. He favored Danish noblemen for important positions, and he imposed heavy taxes on the Swedish peasants and merchants to fund his expensive wars. This, as you can imagine, did not go over well. The main source of tension was Eric's foreign policy, particularly his long and costly war with the Hanseatic League. Eric wanted to control the trade in the Baltic Sea, and he saw the Hanseatic League as a major obstacle. He launched a series of military campaigns against them, but they were largely unsuccessful and a huge drain on the Union's resources. The Swedes, in particular, who had their own trade interests in the Baltic, were not happy about being dragged into a Danish king's wars. The Danish nobles were also not happy about the heavy taxes they had to pay, and Eric's relationship with the Danish Council of State, the Riksrådet, was often strained. The result of all this was a series of internal rebellions and conflicts that would define the rest of the Union's history. The Swedes, who felt they were being treated as a junior partner, were the most rebellious. They launched a series of popular uprisings, led by a charismatic nobleman named Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson. The Engelbrekt Rebellion of the 1430s was a major blow to the Union's authority. Engelbrekt, a nobleman who had suffered at the hands of Eric's policies, rallied the Swedish peasants and miners, and his army managed to defeat Eric's forces and seize control of much of the country. Engelbrekt himself was assassinated a few years later, but his rebellion had shown that the Swedish people were not willing to be ruled by a Danish king who didn't respect their traditions or their interests. The rebellion led to Eric being deposed as king of the Union. He was replaced by his nephew, Christopher of Bavaria, but Christopher also failed to solve the underlying problems. The power of the Danish king over the Union was constantly being challenged by the Swedish nobility, who wanted to have more say in the governance of their own country. The period that followed Christopher's death was a messy and confusing one, with different factions of the nobility in all three kingdoms fighting for control. It was a time of puppet kings, regents, and endless civil wars. This period of internal strife and conflict is a good example of an open historiographic question. Was the Kalmar Union doomed from the start? Was it a beautiful idea that was simply unworkable in practice? Or was it a good idea that was ruined by the poor leadership of Eric of Pomerania. Some scholars argue that the idea of a union of three very different kingdoms, each with its own history and its own interests, was always a pipe dream. The Swedes, with their focus on the eastern Baltic, and the Danes, with their focus on the North Sea and continental Europe, were always going to have different priorities. Others argue that if Margaret had lived longer, or if a more capable king had succeeded her, the union might have survived. It's a question we'll probably never be able to answer, but it's a good one to ponder. The Kalmar Union, for all its potential, was a house built on a shaky foundation, and it would eventually come tumbling down. As the Kalmar Union lurched from crisis to crisis, a new and powerful force was gaining control over the economic life of the entire Baltic region, the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League wasn't a kingdom or an empire. It was a powerful confederation of German merchant guilds and market towns that dominated trade from the Netherlands to Russia. Think of it as a kind of medieval multinational corporation with its own army and navy. The League's headquarters were in the city of Lübeck, and its influence was immense. It controlled the trade in everything from fish to timber to grain, and it was a major player in the politics of Scandinavia. The Hanseatic League's power came from its ability to organize and monopolize trade. It established a series of trading posts, or contours, in key cities all over Northern Europe, including in Scandinavian towns like Bergen, Stockholm, and Visby on the island of Gotland. These contours were not just places of business. They were self-governing communities of German merchants, with their own laws and their own customs. In Bergen, for example, the German merchants of the Hanseatic League, with their distinctive red coats and their powerful trading rights, became a state within a state. They were a powerful and often resented force in the Norwegian economy, and they were a constant source of friction with the local population and the Norwegian king. The Hanseatic League's dominance had a huge impact on the Scandinavian economies. On the one hand, it brought a lot of wealth and a lot of new products to the region. The Hanseatic merchants were master traders, and they helped to connect Scandinavia to the wider European economy. But on the other hand, the League's dominance also meant that the Scandinavian kingdoms often found themselves at a disadvantage. The Hanseatic League was able to use its economic power to extract favorable trade agreements and to pressure the Scandinavian kings. It was a classic case of a powerful economic force dictating terms to a weaker political one. A great example of this power dynamic can be seen in the story of the Danish Hanseatic War of the 1420s. King Eric of Pomerania, the same king who was so bad at running the Kalmar Union, tried to assert his control over the trade in the Baltic by imposing a toll on all ships passing through the Öresund, the strait between Denmark and Sweden. This was a direct challenge to the Hanseatic League's power, and they responded with a declaration of war. The war was a long and costly affair, and it ultimately ended in a stalemate, with neither side able to completely defeat the other. But it showed just how much power the Hanseatic League had. It was a non-state actor that was able to wage a war against a combined kingdom and hold its own. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? The Hanseatic League's influence was also a major source of tension within the Kalmar Union itself. The Swedes, in particular, were very resentful of the League's dominance. The League controlled the trade in iron and copper, two of Sweden's most important exports. and it often used its power to keep prices low. The Swedish peasants and miners, who were the ones doing the hard work, felt that they were being exploited by the German merchants. This resentment was a major factor in the Swedish rebellions against the Union, as the Swedish nobles and peasants saw the Union's inability to stand up to the Hanseatic League as a sign of its weakness and its pro-Danish bias. The Hanseatic League also played a key role in the long and difficult history of the Kalmar Union. The League often sided with the Swedish rebels against the Danish king, providing them with military and financial support. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, and it worked brilliantly. The League knew that a unified and powerful Scandinavia was a threat to its economic dominance, and so it did everything it could to keep the three kingdoms divided. The Hanseatic League was, in many ways, the great puppet master of Scandinavian politics during this period. But like all things, the Hanseatic League's power eventually began to wane. The rise of new trading powers, like the Netherlands and England, and the discovery of new trade routes in the Americas, all contributed to its decline. By the late 15th century, the League was no longer the dominant force it once was. But its legacy in Scandinavia was immense. It had brought wealth and trade to the region, but it had also been a major source of political tension and conflict. The Kalmar Union, in many ways, was a direct response to the threat of the Hanseatic League, and the Union's eventual failure was, in part, a result of the League's constant meddling. The Hanseatic League was a powerful and often a very unwelcome force in the history of medieval Scandinavia, a testament to the power of commerce to shape the course of history. As the Kalmar Union sputtered and the Hanseatic League began its slow decline, a new kind of storm was brewing on the horizon, one that was not military or economic, but religious. This was the Protestant Reformation, a seismic shift in European thought that would forever change the religious and political landscape of Scandinavia. The Reformation began in Germany in 1517, when a monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Luther's ideas, which emphasized a direct relationship between the individual and God, and the supremacy of the Bible over the Pope, spread like wildfire across Northern Europe. Thanks in no small part to the new technology of the printing press, for the Scandinavian kings, the Reformation was a massive opportunity. The Catholic Church was an immensely wealthy and powerful institution. It owned vast tracts of land. It collected huge amounts of taxes, and its bishops and priests often had more political influence than the king. By breaking with the Catholic Church, a king could seize all of that wealth and all of that land for himself. He could also appoint his own bishops and priests, creating a national church that was loyal to him, not to a distant pope in Rome. It was a perfect storm of religious conviction and political opportunism, a chance for a king to become both the secular and the spiritual head of his kingdom. The Reformation came to Denmark first, thanks to its close ties to Germany. The Danish king, Christian III, was a devout Lutheran who had been educated in Germany and was a personal friend of Martin Luther. He was also a king who had to fight a long and bloody civil war to get his throne. He saw the Reformation as a way to consolidate his power and to bring an end to the internal strife. In 1536, Christian III formally broke with the Catholic Church, confiscated all of its property, and established a new, state-controlled Lutheran Church. The transition was relatively smooth, in large part because the king had the support of the Danish nobility, who were eager to get their hands on the church's land. It's a bit like a modern-day government deciding to nationalize a huge, wealthy company. It's a great deal for the government and its supporters, and not so great for the company. In Sweden, the Reformation was a bit more dramatic and a lot more political. The Swedish king, Gustav Vasa, who we'll talk more about in the next section, was a man who had led a war of independence against the Kalmar Union and was now trying to build a strong, centralized kingdom. He saw the Catholic Church as a major obstacle to his power. The Church had supported the Danish king during the war, and its powerful bishops were a constant source of trouble. Gustav Vasa, a man who was as ruthless as he was ambitious, seized the opportunity. In 1527, he convened a parliament in the city of Västerås, and with the support of the Swedish nobility, declared that the king would be the head of the church in Sweden. He then proceeded to confiscate all of the church's land and wealth, using the money to pay off his massive war debts and to build a powerful standing army. The Swedish Reformation, in many ways, was a political revolution disguised as a religious one. Norway's Reformation was a completely different story. Norway was, at the time, still a part of the Kalmar Union, and it was ruled from Copenhagen. The Norwegian Reformation, therefore, was a top-down affair, an order from the Danish king that the country would be Lutheran. The transition was met with a lot of resistance, particularly from the powerful bishops and the local population, who were still very attached to their old Catholic traditions. The king had to use military force to impose the new religion, and the transition was a slow and often violent one. The powerful Archbishop of Trondheim, a man named Olav Engelbrektsson, led a rebellion against the Danish king, but he was eventually defeated and had to flee the country. The Norwegian Reformation, in a way, was a further sign of Norway's loss of autonomy and its subordination to Danish rule. So the Protestant Reformation was a game-changer for all of Scandinavia. It fundamentally reshaped the religious landscape, replacing the old Catholic traditions with a new state-controlled Lutheranism. But more importantly, it had a huge political impact. It allowed the kings of Denmark and Sweden to consolidate their power, to seize the wealth of the church, and to create a new national identity that was based on both a shared language and a shared religion. The Reformation was the final nail in the coffin for the old decentralized world of the Middle Ages, and it was the first step on the road to the modern, powerful nation-states that we know today. The slow, painful dissolution of the Kalmar Union was, for a long time, a story of Swedish resentment and Danish overreach. We've talked about the power struggles and the peasant rebellions, but it all came to a head in the early 16th century with a series of dramatic and bloody events that would finally break the Union for good. The story of the Swedish Wars of Independence is a tale of a ruthless Danish king, a heroic Swedish nobleman, and a massacre that would become a national symbol of resistance. The final act of the Union's collapse began with the reign of the Danish king, Christian II. Christian II was a charismatic but deeply unpopular king, a man who, like his predecessor, Eric of Pomerania, was determined to force the Swedes into submission. He saw the Swedish nobility as the main source of the rebellions and the endless civil wars, and he decided to deal with them once and for all. He launched a military campaign into Sweden, and with the help of a powerful Swedish traitor, managed to conquer the country and get himself crowned king in Stockholm in 1520. To cement his power, Christian II orchestrated an event that would live on in infamy, the Stockholm bloodbath. In the days after his coronation, he invited the most powerful Swedish noblemen and bishops to a banquet at the royal palace. He then had them arrested and accused them of heresy for their support of the rebellions against the Union. Over 100 of them were executed, many of them beheaded in the main square of Stockholm. It was a brutal, cynical act of political terror, a deliberate attempt to decapitate the Swedish opposition and to show the world who was in charge. It had the opposite effect. The Stockholm bloodbath, rather than crushing the Swedish spirit, ignited it. It became the ultimate symbol of Danish tyranny and a rallying cry for a new national resistance. The leader of this new resistance was a young nobleman named Gustav Vasa. Gustav's father was one of the men executed in the Stockholm bloodbath, and Gustav himself had been a prisoner of the Danes. He managed to escape, and he fled to the remote province of Dalarna in central Sweden. Here, among the free-minded peasants and miners, he began to rally support for a new war of independence. He was, by all accounts, a charismatic and inspiring leader, and his story quickly became a national legend. The story of him fleeing on skis and of the men of Dalarna flocking to his banner is one of the most famous in Swedish history. Gustav Vasa's rebellion started small, with just a few hundred men, but it quickly grew. He was a brilliant military strategist, and he knew how to use the terrain and the resources of the Swedish countryside to his advantage. He also had the support of the Hanseatic League, who, as we know, were always happy to see the Danes in trouble. The Hanseatic city of Lübeck, in particular, provided Gustav with military and financial support in exchange for favorable trade agreements. Gustav Vasa's army, with its mix of peasant volunteers and German mercenaries, began to win a series of important battles. The war was a long and brutal one, but it was clear that the tide had turned. Christian II's rule in Sweden was a disaster, and his unpopularity was growing in Denmark and Norway as well. In 1523, the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, formally elected Gustav Vasa as King of Sweden. The Kalmar Union was, for all intents and purposes, over. But the fighting didn't stop there. Gustav Vasa still had to consolidate his power and to drive the last of the Danish forces out of the country. This he did with ruthless efficiency, and by the end of his reign, he had not only freed Sweden from the Union, but had also created a powerful, centralized kingdom. The Swedish Wars of Independence were a defining moment in the history of all of Scandinavia. They marked the final breakup of the Kalmar Union and the emergence of Sweden as a strong, independent nation-state. The Danish king, Christian II, was eventually deposed in his own country and replaced by his uncle, Frederick I. Norway, which had remained loyal to Christian II, was once again caught in the middle. It would remain a part of the Danish kingdom, but it would lose its last vestiges of autonomy and be reduced to the status of a province. The old dream of a united Scandinavia was now dead, and in its place was a new reality of three separate and often warring kingdoms. With the Swedish Wars of Independence now over and the Kalmar Union a thing of the past, Sweden was finally free to chart its own course. And the man who would guide it was the same man who had led the rebellion, Gustav Vasa. Gustav's reign from 1523 to 1560 was a period of incredible transformation. He was not just a king, he was a nation builder. He took a country that was poor, divided, and in debt, and he turned it into a powerful, centralized, and prosperous state. He was a ruthless and brilliant politician, and his legacy is immense. A man who, in many ways, is the father of modern Sweden. Gustav's first order of business was to consolidate his power. He had come to the throne on the back of a peasant rebellion, and he knew that his power was not yet secure. He had to deal with the powerful noblemen who still resisted his authority, and he had to put down a series of internal rebellions from peasants who felt that they had not been rewarded enough for their role in the War of Independence. Gustav was not a man to mess with. He used a combination of political cunning and brute force to crush his enemies, and he established a strong, centralized government that was loyal to him. He was a king who was not afraid to get his hands dirty, and he was not afraid to make a few enemies along the way. One of Gustav's most significant achievements was his role in the Protestant Reformation. As we've discussed, he saw the church as a major obstacle to his power and a source of incredible wealth. He used the Reformation as a political tool, a way to seize the church's land and property, and to get the money he needed to pay for his wars and to build his new state. He also used the Reformation to create a new national church that was loyal to him, not to the Pope. He appointed his own bishops and priests, and he translated the Bible into Swedish, which helped to spread the new faith and to standardize the Swedish language. It was a brilliant move, a perfect marriage of political and religious ambition. Gustav Vasa also completely overhauled the Swedish economy. The country was, at the time, still very much a poor agrarian society. He introduced new taxes, he created a royal navy, and he encouraged trade and commerce. He was a master of finance, and he managed to pay off his massive war debts and to build up a huge royal treasury. He even, according to one story that is probably not true, sent a letter to the King of England, Henry VIII, offering to sell him a few of his old warships. It's a fun story that shows Gustav's pragmatic, very businesslike approach to being a king. He was a man who understood that a strong state needed a strong economy, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. But Gustav's legacy wasn't just about money and power. He was also a great patron of the arts and sciences. He established the first Swedish royal library, and he encouraged the study of history and the Swedish language. He was a king who understood the power of culture to forge a national identity. He was, in many ways, a Renaissance prince, a man who was as comfortable with a book as he was with a sword. He was a complex and contradictory figure, a man who could be both ruthless and enlightened, and his reign was a pivotal moment in the history of Sweden. Gustav Vasa's legacy was also in his role in establishing the hereditary monarchy. Before his time, the Swedish monarchy had been an elective one, with the king being chosen by the parliament. This had been a constant source of civil war and instability. Gustav, with his newfound power, managed to have his sons declared as the legal heirs to the throne, and the Swedish monarchy became a hereditary one. This was a massive change, and it helped to bring a sense of stability and continuity to the Swedish state. So Gustav Vasa's reign was a period of incredible change. He had not only freed Sweden from the Kalmar Union, but had also, in the process, created a new, powerful, and independent nation-state. He was a man who had come to power on the back of a rebellion, and he had used that power to build a kingdom that would, in the centuries to come, become a major European power. The old decentralized world of the Middle Ages was now a thing of the past, and a new, centralized, and very modern state was taking its place. While Sweden was busy becoming a new, independent nation-state under the guiding hand of Gustav Vasa, the other two Scandinavian kingdoms, Denmark and Norway, were a different story. The final collapse of the Kalmar Union did not mean that Denmark and Norway went their separate ways. Instead, Norway, which had remained loyal to the Union, found itself in a new and much less equal political partnership with Denmark. This was the start of the Dano-Norwegian Union, a long-lasting and often difficult political marriage that would endure for centuries. The Dano-Norwegian Union was, from its very beginning, an unequal partnership. Denmark, which had a much larger population and a more powerful economy, was the senior partner. Norway, which had been a part of the Union for so long, had lost its royal line, and its most powerful noble families were either gone or had been absorbed into the Danish nobility. The capital of the Union was in Copenhagen, and the country was ruled by the Danish king and a Danish council of state. Norway, in essence, was reduced to the status of a Danish province, a kind of afterthought in the grand scheme of Danish politics. The political situation in Norway was a bit of a mess. The country had no king, no parliament, and no separate administration. It was ruled by a stadtholder, or governor, who was appointed by the Danish king. The Norwegian nobility, which had been a powerful force in the Middle Ages, was now a small and relatively powerless group. The church, which had been a major institution in medieval Norway, was also now a part of the Danish-controlled Lutheran Church. The old, distinct Norwegian identity was slowly being eroded, and the country's unique history and culture were at risk of being lost. But here's a good little mystery to chew on. Did the Norwegians actually mind? The historical record is a bit mixed. On the one hand, there were a few small-scale peasant rebellions and some grumbling from the remaining Norwegian nobles. But for the most part, the country remained quiet. The reasons for this are a subject of debate among historians. Some argue that the Norwegians were simply too poor and too politically weak to mount a serious rebellion. Others argue that the Danish rule, while paternalistic, was not necessarily oppressive. The Danish kings provided a sense of stability and a sense of order, and they protected Norway's trade routes and its fishing grounds. The Danish administration, while a bit heavy-handed, was also relatively efficient, and it helped to bring a sense of law and order to the country. The Dano-Norwegian Union, for all its faults, did have some benefits for Norway. It was a period of peace and prosperity. The Danish kings, with their powerful navy, were able to protect Norway's long coastline from pirates and other invaders. The Danish administration also helped to modernize Norway's legal and political systems. The country was, in a way, being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. The Dano-Norwegian Union was also a cultural melting pot. The Danish language, which was the language of the court and the administration, had a huge impact on the Norwegian language, and many Danish customs and traditions were adopted by the Norwegian people. But this period also saw the rise of a new kind of Norwegian nationalism, a quiet intellectual movement that was centered around the preservation of Norwegian history and culture. Scholars and poets began to write about the old Viking sagas, the medieval Norwegian kings, and the unique beauty of the Norwegian landscape, they were, in a way, trying to remind the Norwegian people of who they were and of the long, proud history that they had. This movement, though it was small at first, would eventually grow into a powerful force that would, in the 19th century, lead to a full-blown independence movement. So the Dano-Norwegian Union was a complex and fascinating period in the history of Scandinavia. It was a time of both stability and stagnation, of both cultural exchange and the loss of autonomy. It was a period where one kingdom, Norway, was slowly being absorbed into another, Denmark. But it was also a period where a new kind of national identity, a quiet, intellectual nationalism, was taking root. The Dano-Norwegian Union was not a story of a glorious union, but of a long, difficult political marriage, a story that would eventually, after many centuries, end in a quiet and peaceful divorce. The Kalmar Union, the beautiful and ambitious project of Queen Margaret Thorn, had survived for over 120 years, but it was a union in name only. As we've seen, the Swedish Wars of Independence had effectively ended the union, and the emergence of Gustav Vasa as King of Sweden had created a new, powerful, and independent nation-state. But the official breakup was a much longer, messier process, a period of intermittent warfare and political maneuvering that would finally bring an end to the dream of a united Scandinavia. The final breakup of the Union was a slow-motion car crash that happened over several centuries. After Gustav Vasa's victory, Denmark and Norway remained united under a single king, but Sweden was now a completely separate entity. The Danish kings, however, were not about to give up their claim to the Swedish throne. For the next century, the two kingdoms were in a state of almost constant warfare, a long and bloody series of conflicts that historians call the Dano-Swedish Wars. These wars were fought over control of the Baltic Sea, over the trade routes, and over the old claim of the Danish king to the Swedish throne. It was a vicious, no-holds-barred conflict, a bit like two divorced parents who are still fighting over who gets the kids. The most dramatic of these wars was the Kalmar War, which lasted from 1611 to 1613. The war was started by the young and ambitious Danish king Christian IV, who, like his predecessors, wanted to reassert Danish dominance over the Baltic. He launched a surprise attack on the Swedish border town of Kalmar and quickly seized control of the city. The Swedes, who were still a relatively new and not so powerful kingdom, were caught off guard. The Danish king, in his hubris, had a grand vision of a renewed Kalmar Union, and he believed that he could force the Swedes back into the fold. But the Swedish king at the time, Gustavus Adolphus, was a military genius. He was a young and brilliant ruler who would, in a few years, become one of the most famous generals in European history. He was not about to let his kingdom be swallowed up by the Danes. He fought a long and bloody defensive war, and he eventually managed to force the Danes to a peace treaty. The treaty was a bit of a mixed bag for Sweden. They had to pay a huge indemnity, but they did not have to give up their independence. The Kalmar War was a major turning point. It showed that Sweden was no longer a junior partner, and that it was a military power in its own right. The old dream of a Danish-led union was now dead for good. The final nail in the coffin for the Kalmar Union was the rise of Sweden as a true great power. In the 17th century, under the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus and his successors, Sweden became a military juggernaut. It conquered vast territories in the Baltic in Germany, and in Russia, and it became the dominant power in Northern Europe. This period, known as the Swedish Empire, was a time of immense military glory and immense wealth for Sweden. The Danish kings, who had once been the masters of Scandinavia, were now relegated to the sidelines, a kind of spectator watching their old rival become the new boss. The legacy of the Kalmar Union was also a cultural one. The Union, for all its political failures, had created a shared sense of Scandinavian identity. The three kingdoms, with their shared history and their similar languages, were still, in many ways, a single cultural entity. This sense of shared identity would, in the centuries to come, be a major force in the rise of a new kind of Scandinavianism, a political and cultural movement that sought to bring the three kingdoms together in a new, more peaceful way. But that was for the future. For now, the old union was dead, and in its place was a new reality of three separate and often warring kingdoms. And here's a little historical footnote for you. The flag of the Kalmar Union, which was a yellow cross on a red background, was used as a symbol of unity and a symbol of Danish power for many years. But after the breakup of the Union, it was largely forgotten. Today, it is a kind of historical curiosity, a reminder of a time when the dream of a united Scandinavia was a real and often a very bloody thing. The Kalmar Union, for all its faults, was a beautiful but ultimately unworkable idea, a kind of medieval political experiment that failed. But its legacy, in the form of the independent nation-states of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, would live on for centuries to come. While Sweden was rising to great power status, the Dano-Norwegian Union, the political marriage that was forged in the aftermath of the Kalmar Union's collapse, was still going strong. But going strong is a bit of a subjective term here. It was, in many ways, a lopsided affair, a partnership where one partner, Denmark, was clearly the dominant one. Norway, as we've discussed, had lost its autonomy, its royal line, and its most powerful nobility. It was, for all intents and purposes, a province of Denmark, and its history for the next several centuries would be one of quiet subordination and slow but steady decline. The Dano-Norwegian Union was a peculiar entity. It was a union of two kingdoms under a single king, but it was ruled entirely from Copenhagen. The official language of the court and the administration was Danish, and the most important positions in government and the military were held by Danes. The Norwegian economy, which was based on fishing and forestry, was heavily taxed to fund the Danish king's expensive wars and his lavish court. Norway, in essence, was a cash cow for the Danish crown, a kind of colonial outpost that was exploited for its natural resources. But this period also saw a quiet cultural flourishing in Norway. With no king and no capital city, the country's cultural life became centered around its small towns and its rural communities. Norwegian artists, writers, and scholars, though they were often educated in Denmark, began to write and think about Norwegian history and culture. They collected the old sagas, the folk tales, and the peasant songs, and they began to publish them. This was a form of passive resistance, a way of reminding the Norwegian people of their unique identity and their long, proud history. It was a kind of cultural nationalism that would, in the centuries to come, become a major political force. And here's a good little mystery to ponder. To what extent did the Norwegians actually speak Danish? The official language of the Union was Danish, and the Norwegian elite, the merchants, the priests, and the administrators all spoke and wrote in Danish. But in the countryside, among the farmers and the fishermen, the old Norwegian dialects, which were a bit like a mix of Danish and Swedish, remained. The long-term result of this was a kind of linguistic split. The written language of Norway became a form of Danish, but the spoken language remained Norwegian. This linguistic divide would, in the 19th century, become a major political issue, and it would lead to a long and often contentious debate about which language, the Danish-influenced one or the rural, dialect-based one, was the true Norwegian language. It's a great example of how politics, even in the absence of a parliament or a king, can shape the very language a people speak. The Dano-Norwegian Union came to a dramatic and unexpected end in the early 19th century, in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. Denmark, which had sided with Napoleon, was on the losing side of the conflict. In 1814, the great powers of Europe, who were busy redrawing the map of Europe, decided to punish Denmark for its loyalty to Napoleon. The Treaty of Kiel was signed, and Denmark was forced to cede Norway to Sweden. It was a brutal, cynical act of political horse trading, a bit like two people trading a piece of furniture that doesn't belong to them. The Norwegians, as you can imagine, were not happy about this. They had not been consulted, and they did not want to be a part of the Swedish kingdom. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. A group of Norwegian politicians and noblemen convened a national assembly in a town called Eidsvoll, and they drew up a new constitution, a beautiful and very modern document that was based on the principles of the American and French revolutions. They then elected a Danish prince, a man named Christian Frederick, as their new king. It was a bold and audacious act of defiance, and it was a direct challenge to the great powers of Europe. The Swedes, however, were not about to let this stand. A Swedish army, led by the crown prince, a man named Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a former French general who had been adopted by the Swedish king, invaded Norway. The war was short and largely bloodless, and the Norwegians, who were no match for the professional Swedish army, were forced to capitulate. But the Swedish king, to his credit, was not a tyrant. He agreed to accept the new Norwegian constitution, and he agreed that Norway and Sweden would be a union of two equal but separate kingdoms. The Dano-Norwegian Union was officially over, and in its place was a new and much more equal Swedish-Norwegian Union. This was a major turning point, a final act in the long and difficult history of the Kalmar Union, and it was a new beginning for Norway. We have now reached the end of our journey, a long and winding road that has taken us from the dawn of the Viking Age to the final breakup of the great Scandinavian unions. But before we drift off to sleep, let's take a moment to reflect on the enduring legacy of this period. The medieval history of Scandinavia was a story of fierce warriors, ambitious kings, and a constant struggle for power and independence. But it was also a story of trade, of cultural exchange, and of a slow but steady integration into the wider European world. The legacy of this period is not just in the ruins of the long forts or the pages of the sagas. It is in the very fabric of modern Scandinavia, in its culture, its language, and its political institutions. The most obvious legacy of the medieval era is in the languages. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish are all North Germanic languages, and they are so similar that speakers of each can often understand each other. This is a direct result of their shared history, of the centuries they spent as part of the same kingdom and the same cultural sphere. But the languages are also subtly different, a reflection of their distinct histories. The Norwegian language, with its mix of Danish and Old Norse, and its ongoing debates about which version is the real one, is a perfect example of this. The languages are, in a way, a living testament to the long, difficult, and intertwined history of the three kingdoms. The political institutions of modern Scandinavia are also a direct result of the medieval era. The strong, centralized monarchies of Denmark and Sweden, which were forged in the fires of the Reformation and the Great Wars, were a direct result of the efforts of men like Gustav Vasa and Christian IV. The long and peaceful history of the Dano-Norwegian Union, which, for all its faults, provided a sense of stability and a sense of order, also had a huge impact on the development of Norway's political culture. The medieval tradition of a strong, centralized government, combined with a powerful sense of local autonomy, is a defining feature of all three modern Scandinavian states. The parliaments, the legal systems, and the national churches are all a direct result of the long, difficult process of state building that began in the Middle Ages. But perhaps the most profound legacy of this period is in the culture. The Viking sagas, the old folk tales, and the medieval ballads are still a part of the cultural landscape of all three countries. The image of the fierce, independent Viking warrior is still a powerful symbol of national identity, a kind of cultural touchstone that reminds people of their long and proud history. But this is also a legacy that has been reinterpreted and reinvented over the centuries. The Vikings, who were once seen as pagan barbarians, were later romanticized as noble, freedom-loving heroes. This romanticized view of the Vikings, which was a product of the 19th century nationalist movements, has had a huge impact on how we, in the modern world, see them. And here's a final thought for you to chew on. The history of Scandinavia is, in many ways, a story of an outsider becoming an insider. The Vikings started their history as a threat from the periphery, a group of pagan warriors who were a constant source of fear and anxiety for the rest of Europe. But over the course of the Middle Ages, they became an integral part of the European community. They converted to Christianity. They established powerful, centralized kingdoms, and they became major players in the politics and the economy of Europe. The story of Scandinavia is, in a way, the story of a successful assimilation, of a people who managed to retain their unique identity, while also becoming a part of something larger. And so, with that final thought, our long journey through the history of medieval Scandinavia comes to an end. We've talked about a lot of things, from the longships and the raiding to the Reformation and the national identities. It's a complex and fascinating story, a tale of a people who went from being the terror of the seas to the builders of some of the most stable and prosperous states in the modern world. It's a testament to their resilience, their ingenuity, and their quiet but unyielding sense of purpose. As the echoes of the sagas and the clash of swords fade into the background, I hope you can feel the quiet strength of those who sailed the icy seas and built a new world for themselves. Close your eyes now and let the images of those distant lands and those long-gone people settle peacefully in your mind. The long ships are now silent, the battles are over, and the kings are at rest. May your dreams be as long and as peaceful as the history we have just explored.